You have been good, not occasionally, consistently. You have been the person who shows up, the person who absorbs, the person who doesn't make things harder for others. You were patient when you had every reason to be impatient. You were generous when you had every reason to hold back. You said yes when you wanted to say no, and stayed silent when you had every right to say something. And yet, something doesn't add up. It's not that people treat you badly. It's something more corrosive than that. It's that people don't quite register you, not really. Your opinions carry less weight than they should. Your presence in a room doesn't change anything. Decisions are made without your involvement, because it simply didn't occur to them that your input mattered. And you keep thinking, if I'm just a little more understanding, a little more patient, a little more generous, eventually they'll notice. But they don't. And the reason they don't isn't what you think it is. What I'm going to explain in this video is something most people never reach, because the explanation requires you to face something uncomfortable about the nature of human relationships. It requires you to abandon the idea that kindness by itself generates respect, because it doesn't. And Schopenhauer knew exactly why. There is a specific transition that happens in relationships, long-term friendships, work environments, romantic partnerships, family dynamics, that almost no one notices while it's happening. There isn't a moment where someone looks at you differently and you can point to it. It happens through the accumulation of small moments where nothing goes wrong. The transition is this: you stop being perceived as a person and start being perceived as a function. A person has moods. A person has preferences that sometimes conflict with yours. A person takes up space, asserts themselves occasionally, demands some level of negotiation. A function does none of that. A function processes inputs and returns outputs. A function doesn't need to be considered. It needs to be used. When you consistently make yourself available, when you consistently absorb inconvenience, when you consistently adjust to everyone else's shape, you train the environment around you. You train the people in your life to expect zero friction from you. And once that expectation is established, anything that deviates from it, any moment you assert a preference, any moment you refuse, is perceived as an interruption, an anomaly. You have become so predictably good that you've turned into part of the background, not rejected, just not registered as a complete presence. And this is a profoundly different kind of problem, because there is nothing to address. No conflict to resolve, no misunderstanding to clarify, just an absence of registration that no one feels responsible for, because no one did anything wrong. Think about the people in your life who command genuine respect, not fear, not authority because of a title, but real weight that gets considered. The people whose opinions shift the direction of a conversation. The people whose approval means something, whose disapproval means something. What do they have in common? They have friction, not hostility, friction. You feel at some point in the interaction that they have a shape, that they take up space, that there are things they won't do, perspectives they won't abandon, moments when they simply won't adjust to you. And that quality, that solidity, is what makes them present. It's what makes them real to you in a way that requires you to take them into account. You are not that. You have spent years becoming the opposite of that. And the respect you want exists precisely in the direction you've been moving away from. When someone spends years being good, genuinely, intentionally good, and then discovers that this produces something closer to invisibility than respect, the interpretation that comes up first is almost always moral. People are ungrateful. The world rewards selfishness. Kindness is a weakness that gets exploited. that interpretation is wrong. Not completely wrong. There are genuinely ungrateful people, genuinely exploitative dynamics. But as a general explanation for why kindness doesn't generate respect, it's wrong. And more importantly, it's useless, because it points outward, and the problem is partially internal. The real problem is a misreading of social dynamics, a fundamental confusion between what you intend and what your behavior produces. You believe your generosity is perceived as generosity, that when you help someone, they register it as an act of will, as you choosing from a position of fullness to contribute something. But that's not what they register. What they register is the pattern, and the pattern says, this person helps unconditionally, which means the help stops being meaningful as a choice. It becomes expected. It becomes the baseline. Schopenhauer had a line that cuts through this precisely. He wrote that we do not resent the stone for being cold, nor thank it for being warm when the sun falls on it. The stone has no agency. It does not choose, and that which cannot choose cannot be respected. It can only be used or avoided. When your kindness becomes indistinguishable from compulsion, when people perceive, even without articulating it, that you would help regardless of how they treat you, your kindness loses value as a signal. It stops communicating something meaningful about the relationship. It becomes environmental, like gravity, like air. No one thanks the air, and I'm not saying that because people are ungrateful, but because the air didn't choose to be there. That's the misreading. You are offering something valuable, but you have removed all the conditions under which that value would be recognized, and the correction doesn't start by changing how others think about you. It starts with understanding exactly what you have been offering and what you have been signaling in the process. Arthur Schopenhauer had no patience for the sentimental view of human relationships. He did not believe people connected through moral affinity, through virtue recognizing virtue. He believed people connected and remained connected based on something far more primitive and far more honest, the weight of presence, the gravitational pull of a will that asserts itself in the world. Relationships, in this framing, are not moral contracts. They are not arrangements built on shared values or mutual kindness. They are balances of competing forces. And in any balance, what determines how much space you occupy is not what you intend. It is how much your removal would destabilize the arrangement. Think about that for a moment. Not how much your presence contributes, how much your absence would disrupt. If you disappeared from a relationship, stopped being available, stopped absorbing, stopped adjusting, how much would actually change for the other person? Not emotionally, not in terms of missing you, but practically, structurally. How much would they have to change their own behavior? For many people who have spent years being good, the honest answer to that question is uncomfortable. Because they have become so easy to use and so easy to ignore that their absence would require almost no adjustment. Something else would fill the function. Something, or someone, would absorb the friction. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he described the relationship between value and perceived necessity. Value that can always be replaced is not experienced as value. It is experienced as an available resource, a tap you can turn on. And you don't worry about a tap until it runs dry. The hidden economy of relationships does not operate based on what you give, but on the cost of your giving, both to produce and to replace. When you give from a place that appears unlimited, what you are really communicating is, this costs me nothing. I have infinite supply, and things with infinite supply have no scarcity. And things without scarcity have no value in the economic sense, because the structure of exchange does not require anyone to treat them as precious. You are not running out of kindness, but people need to perceive that you could. They need to perceive that there are conditions under which you would withdraw it, not as a threat, not as manipulation, but simply as a natural consequence of the fact that you are a person with a finite interior, with preferences, limits, and a self that can be depleted. As long as they cannot perceive that, as long as you appear inexhaustible, unconditional, infinitely accommodating, your kindness will not be registered as kindness. It will be registered as the default state of things, and you cannot be grateful for the default state of things. You simply take it for granted. If what you're hearing is naming something you felt for a long time without being able to articulate it, the subscribe button is below. No promises of transformation, just more analyses like this, and often not that comfortable. There is a paradox at the center of availability that almost no one sees clearly. The more available you are, the less impact you have. This is not intuitive. It feels like the opposite. Everything in the cultural narrative around relationships says that being present, showing up, being reliable, being consistent is the foundation of connection and respect. And there is truth in that, but only up to a point. Only if that availability exists within a structure that still has weight. Only if it is the availability of someone who could, in principle, not be there. When availability becomes unconditional, when the people around you have no experience of you being unavailable, no memory of you having said no, no sense that your time and attention have limits, availability itself becomes meaningless. It's like a light that is always on. You stop noticing it. You only notice the light when it goes out. Predictability is the mechanism here. The human nervous system is wired to detect change, not continuity. It registers deviations from baseline, not the baseline itself. When you are always consistent, always accommodating, always the same in your generosity, you train the nervous systems of the people around you to stop perceiving you. You become wallpaper, present but not noticed, there but not felt. And this is where it becomes genuinely cruel, because the people who fall into this pattern are usually the most attentive and the most emotionally intelligent. They perceive everyone. And the terrible irony is that this attention, this constant calibration to others, signals to those same people that no calibration is required in return. You have already done it. There is nothing left for them to navigate. So they stop navigating. And when they stop navigating you, when you do not require thought, consideration, you cease to be a presence that exerts any force on them. You become the easiest part of their life, and the easiest part of anyone's life is the part they think about the least. The paradox is this: genuine respect requires some degree of effort from the person offering it. It requires that the person who respects you has to think, even minimally, about how to engage with you. And that thinking only happens when you present something that cannot simply be assumed: a limit, a preference, a point beyond which you will not go. What you need is not to become unavailable. What you need is to stop being unconditionally available. The distinction matters enormously. One is withdrawal. The other is the reintroduction of your own interior as a real variable in the equation of the relationship. This is the part that requires the most honesty and the most willingness to face something that is genuinely uncomfortable. Ask yourself, as precisely as you can, when you are being good, when you give in, when you absorb, when you help, when you smooth things over, Are you acting from generosity or are you avoiding something? Because those two things can look identical from the outside. They can feel similar on the inside, but they are not the same thing. And the difference between them is the difference between a life you are building and a life in which you are merely managing damage. Genuine generosity comes from a position of fullness. It is the act of someone who has enough self-respect, enough internal stability, enough security, to be able to give without diminishing themselves. It does not require a specific outcome. It does not produce resentment when it is not recognized, because it was already complete in the act of giving. Avoidance looks like generosity, but functions as a defensive maneuver. It is the act of someone managing a threat, the threat of conflict, of disapproval, of the discomfort that arises when you take up space and someone pushes back against it. Every yes that comes from that place is, in reality, a preemptive surrender. Every smile that absorbs disrespect is, in reality, a de-escalation strategy. Every time you justify someone's bad behavior to yourself as they're just stressed or it's not worth it, you are protecting yourself from a confrontation you have decided you cannot afford. The cost of this strategy is not immediately visible. In the short term it works. It produces peace. It keeps everything smooth. It sustains the surface of relationships that would crack if you stopped managing them so carefully. But in the medium and long term, it accumulates something specific, a shapeless dissatisfaction that doesn't know where to go, a kind of fatigue that has nothing to do with your workload, a growing sense that you are invisible to the very people you have worked hardest to keep. Schopenhauer would say that the will does not dissolve when it is repressed. It finds other channels. It leaks into the body as fatigue, into relationships as a subtle bitterness that has no clear target, into your experience of the world as a low-grade conviction that nothing you do really makes a difference. Because, functionally, in the relational economy you have built, nothing you do has been allowed to make a real difference. You have smoothed out all consequences so efficiently that cause and effect have been separated from each other. Actions have no impact. Gestures are not registered. You are operating in a frictionless environment that you created yourself, and it is suffocating you. The hardest part of this recognition is that it does not distribute blame cleanly. It does not allow you to say, "They took advantage of me." It requires you to say, "I created the conditions under which being taken advantage of was the natural outcome, and I called those conditions kindness." That is not comfortable. But it is the only version of the truth from which something can actually change. The first impulse when this realization lands almost always goes in the wrong direction. You pull back. You start responding more slowly, more briefly. You refuse requests you would have previously fulfilled automatically. You introduce a distance that has nothing to do with what you actually feel. It is a performance of self-control that does not come from genuine self-control. It comes from the wound, from the anger, from the embarrassment of having been invisible for so long. It is compensation. And the problem with compensation is that it is still entirely organized around the other person. Before you said yes to manage their comfort. Now you say no to manage your dignity. The axis has not changed. You are still reacting to them, still being defined by the dynamic rather than by something internal. The behavior has inverted, the structure has not. People perceive this. They cannot always articulate it, but they feel the artificiality of the change. They were never like this before. There is a texture to forced coldness that is different from genuine distance. Genuine distance comes from a full interior moving in another direction. Forced coldness comes from an empty interior trying to perform a solidity it has not built. The strategy of coldness also fails on its own terms. It does not produce respect. It produces caution, sometimes resentment, sometimes a subtle contempt. The kind of contempt people feel towards someone who is clearly performing something, because performance is still an attempt to obtain the other's attention and approval. The performance of coldness says, "I will no longer try to please you," but the fact that it is a performance reveals that you are still entirely oriented toward the other, still trying to produce an effect in them, still in the same fundamental posture of reacting instead of being. Coldness without substance is just another form of absence, and absence, as we have already established, is exactly the problem you started with. You do not resolve invisibility by becoming a different kind of invisible. Let me be precise here because precision matters. The problem is not your kindness. This is not something comforting said to make you feel better. It is an accurate description of the actual mechanism. Kindness, generosity, patience, consideration, that is not the problem. They are in fact valuable qualities. They make relationships sustainable. They make you someone worth knowing. That is not what is destroying your capacity to be respected. What is destroying your capacity to be respected is a specific quality of how your kindness is positioned. And that quality has a name: the absence of consequence. When your kindness has no conditions, when the people around you have learned through repeated experience that your kindness arrives unconditionally, that your patience has no end, that your accommodation does not depend on how you are treated, your kindness stops functioning as a signal. A signal only carries information if it can change. If it is always on, it says nothing. If your kindness is guaranteed regardless of the circumstances, it communicates nothing about the relationship. It does not say, "I choose this because of what exists between us." It says, "This is simply what I am. This is simply what I do. You did not have to earn this and you cannot lose it." And that is what needs to change, not the kindness itself, the structure within which it operates. Kindness that emerges as a choice, that exists in a context where the alternative is genuinely possible, where the other person can feel, even unconsciously, that your generosity depends on something real between you, carries weight. It communicates something. It creates a form of debt that is not transactional, not about keeping score, but is simply the recognition that something of value was given and could have not been. Without that structure, your kindness is like the weather. Vaguely appreciated when it is good, barely noticed. Certainly not respected, because you do not respect the weather. You experience the weather. You do not want to be experienced. You want to be taken into account. Respect is not a feeling. It is not a decision someone makes about you based on their own morality or capacity for gratitude. It is a response to a specific kind of perception, the perception that you have weight, that your presence alters the field, that engaging with you requires something, attention, calibration, consideration, that would not be necessary if you were not there. This is uncomfortable to say directly, but it matters. People do not respect you because you deserve it. They respect you because their nervous system has registered through direct experience that not taking you into account produces different results, worse, or at least different, than taking you into account. Respect is the relational equivalent of an object having mass. The object did not earn its mass, but its mass is real, and anything that comes into contact with it has to adjust to it. You cannot have a defined presence in a relationship where you have never been an obstacle. You can only be defined by your limits, and your limits only become visible when you hold them against something, when you do not yield, when you assert yourself, when you take up space enough that the other has to adjust to it. This is not aggression or domination. It is simply the social equivalent of being solid, of being a real object rather than a permeable gas, of having a self that, by the simple fact of existing, requires the people around it to take it into account. The people who command the deepest respect, not the most dominant, but the most genuinely respected, are often quiet, but they are solid. When they speak, it carries a different weight. When they are absent from a decision, something feels incomplete. When they refuse to do something, it means something, because they have always been, in fact, present, fully occupying their own interior, rather than emptying it in service of everyone else's comfort. What changes is not, primarily, behavior, or rather, the behavioral changes are a consequence of something more fundamental. And what is more fundamental is the place from which you act. Right now, for many people in this pattern, that place is external. Before speaking, you run a calculation. How will this be received? Will it create friction? Will it disappoint? Is the possible reaction worth it? The question you are not asking or not asking first is, what do I actually think? What do I actually want? The internal repositioning is the practice of restoring that question to its proper place in the sequence, not as the only consideration, not as a license for selfishness or indifference to others, but as the first thing you consult before constructing your response to anything. It sounds simple. It isn't. For someone who has spent years operating from external calculation first, consulting an internal reference point requires relearning something that was conditioned to disappear. At the beginning, you will notice that this internal point is imprecise, that you do not know exactly what you think until you have already done the external calculation and started building the response that will create the least friction. The internal signal is weak because it has not been exercised. The second part of this is learning to stop negotiating everything internally before it reaches your speech. The person who negotiates everything internally before speaking sounds, from the outside, strangely hesitant, because by the time the thought reaches the mouth, it has already been reduced, softened, qualified, and pre-compromised to the point that it barely holds as a position. The third part is learning to tolerate social discomfort, to be able to remain in it without immediately dissolving it by yielding. When you take up space, in a real full way, part of that space inevitably comes into contact with the space of the other, which may feel a slight friction. That friction is not evidence that you did something wrong. It is the natural and healthy consequence of two distinct wills existing in proximity. You can cause that, and in fact you have been conditioned to believe that you cannot. You can. The question this leaves you with, and I want to leave it as a question, not turn it into an answer, is this. If you knew for certain that your kindness would never be recognized as kindness, if you knew that the world will not organize itself around your virtue, if you knew that respect would have to be built through presence, weight, and the willingness to be, at times, inconvenient, would you still choose to be good? The answer to that question says something very important about whether your kindness is a value you hold or a strategy you have been executing. And only one of those versions of kindness has a future in a world that does not cooperate with your expectations. Schopenhauer already gave his answer. He was notoriously difficult, not very accommodating, not inclined to soften his positions for social comfort. And from that position, he wrote some of the most compassionate philosophy of the 19th century. The two things were not in conflict. They were the same thing, a will that found its form, a self solid enough to be kind, because kindness did not cost him anything essential, because there was no self-erasure at its center. This is where it ends, and this is not a prescription, nor a list of things to do differently, with a distinction. The distinction between a kindness that comes from fullness and a kindness that comes from fear, between a self that gives from solidity and a self that gives in an attempt to build it, between acting from a position and disappearing to avoid having one. You already know which one you have been living. The question is what you do now that you can name it. Subscribe until the next discomfort.